He said it in front of his staff, and he said it with a smile. "Look at those stupid skis." The colonel, his name appears in Finnish intelligence records from the winter of 1939 as part of a captured document summary, identified only as a senior officer of the 18th Rifle Division, was reviewing reconnaissance photographs of Finnish reservists moving through the forest outside Lemmi. The photographs showed men in white, barely distinguishable from the tree line, carrying wooden skis and rifles slung across their backs. No armored vehicles, no artillery train, no motorized column, just men in the snow, on wood, moving through trees. He passed the photographs around the table with the confidence of a man sharing a joke everyone already understood. His staff smiled with him. It was the correct response. 6 weeks later, those men on wooden skis had killed or captured more than a third of his division. They had done it by moving through terrain his troops could not enter, at speeds his infantry could not match, in temperatures his uniforms could not sustain, against positions his command structure could not locate or predict. They had done it in white, against white, in silence, appearing from directions that the tactical maps had marked as impassable, and disappearing back into the same directions before the surviving Soviets could raise their rifles. The photographs were still on his table when his headquarters was overrun. He was not in it when it happened. He had been evacuated 2 days earlier, which is the only reason his name survives in the documents at all rather than in the casualty rolls with the 3,700 men his division lost on the Karelian front in December 1939 alone. The skis were not stupid. The skis were the entire war, and the Soviet Union had looked directly at them, smiled, and put the photographs down. This is the story of what happens when an army dresses for the war it expects and finds itself standing in the war that exists. It is a story about uniforms and musicians and linen sheets, and the particular arrogance of a system so confident in its own image of power that it forgot to ask whether that image was visible to the enemy, and whether being visible to the enemy in a Finnish winter was a feature or a fatal flaw. It begins, as so many disasters begin, with a celebration that happened too early. In the last days of November 1939, as the Red Army was finalizing its crossing of the Finnish border, the logistics apparatus of the Leningrad Military District was managing 2 simultaneous inventories. The first was the standard inventory of a military offensive operation: ammunition, fuel, food, medical supplies, artillery shells, communications equipment, winter lubricants for vehicle engines. The second inventory was smaller, stranger, and in retrospect the most precise measurement available of the institutional confidence that governed every decision made in the weeks that followed. The second inventory contained musical instruments, brass instruments, primarily, drums, the full complement of a Soviet military parade band, loaded into supply trucks and transported toward the Finnish border along with the rifles and the shells, because the planning staff of the Leningrad Military District had concluded formally, in writing, as part of the operational planning process, that the Finnish campaign would conclude quickly enough that the victorious Red Army would march into Helsinki and would require a band for the occasion. The band was not an afterthought or a joke. It was a logistical commitment. Someone had filled out the requisition forms. Someone had approved them. Someone had loaded the instruments onto trucks. The entire apparatus of Soviet military bureaucracy had processed the assumption of easy victory, not as an informal expectation, but as an operational requirement, concrete enough to ship brass tubas through the Finnish winter. General Kirill Meretskov, commanding the Leningrad Military District and the architect of the invasion plan, had told his superiors that Finland could be subdued in 12 days. Some accounts record the estimate as 2 weeks, some record it as 10 days. The exact figure varies by source, but the range is consistent: not months, not weeks plural, but days. A matter of days before the Finnish question would be resolved and the triumphant columns could proceed to the capital. Meretskov was not a fool. He had commanded Soviet forces in the Spanish Civil War. He had studied the operational capacity of his own forces with the thorough professionalism of a career military officer who understood large-scale combined arms operations. He had read the intelligence assessments of Finnish military capability and found them accurately depressing. Finland had a small army, limited artillery, no significant armored force, and a population that could not sustain attrition against a Soviet force, drawing from reserves that dwarfed it. He was right about all of those things. He was wrong about what they meant. What they meant, in Meretskov's calculation, was that the campaign would be short because the imbalance of material power was too extreme to produce any other outcome. What they actually meant was that Finland would fight the kind of war that the imbalance of material power made necessary, a war where the things the Soviet Union had in overwhelming quantity were made as irrelevant as possible, and the things Finland had that the Soviet Union lacked entirely were made as decisive as possible. The things Finland had that the Soviet Union lacked entirely were these: knowledge of the terrain, the right clothing, and wooden skis. The Soviet troops who crossed the Finnish border in late November 1939 wore the standard Red Army winter uniform, a dark olive greatcoat over woolen undergarments, felt boots called valenki, and a dark-colored Ashanka fur hat. In the Ukrainian winter, in the Western Soviet steppe, in the operational environments where these uniforms had been designed and tested, they were adequate. The Soviet Quartermaster Corps had rated them for temperatures down to approximately -25 degrees Celsius, with reasonable effectiveness. The Finnish winter in 1939 was not the Ukrainian winter. The Finnish winter on the Karelian Isthmus, and in the Central Lake District, and in the forests of Suomussalmi was a different category of cold. -30, -40, 3-3 on the worst mornings, a cold so deep that it changed the physical properties of the materials that men carried and wore and depended upon. Engine oil became viscous paste. Rifle bolts required careful warming before they would cycle. Rubber seals failed. Radio batteries discharged in hours instead of days. And dark olive greatcoats, against a landscape of white that extended in every direction without interruption, made every Soviet soldier a dark shape against a white background at ranges where Finnish rifles could resolve the target with complete clarity. The Finnish army had understood this before the war began. The solution they implemented was not sophisticated by any standard that the Soviet military planning apparatus would have recognized as a serious logistical operation. Finnish soldiers were issued white camouflage overgarments when available, and when not available, they were told to find white fabric and make their own. In the first weeks of the war, a significant portion of the Finnish soldiers operating in the forward areas were wearing camouflage made from civilian bed linen. Sheets, tablecloths, curtain panels, anything white, sewn into rough coveralls and pulled over their regular clothing. The Soviet military, which had shipped parade band instruments to the Finnish front, had not shipped white camouflage. The first Finnish soldier a Soviet conscript might see in the forest would be a white shape moving between white trees. The last Finnish soldier that same conscript would see would be the white shape that stopped moving. Because a Finnish soldier who stopped moving in the forest was no longer a shape at all. He was the forest. A Soviet soldier wearing olive against that same forest was a target that required no skill to identify. He was visible from the moment he stepped out of the tree line. He was visible at rest and in motion. He was visible at conditions of reduced light that should have provided concealment, because the contrast between dark wool and white snow does not require full daylight to resolve. The dark shape in the white landscape is one of the most basic targets in visual recognition, and the Soviet army had dressed its entire invasion force in dark shapes and sent them into a white landscape without apparent consideration of what this would mean in practice. It meant that the Finnish soldier could see the Soviet soldier at ranges where the Soviet soldier could not identify the Finnish soldier at all. It meant that every engagement in open terrain, in the forest margins, on the frozen lakes, on the roads, every engagement that was not fought in absolute darkness or in visibility reduced to near zero by snowstorm, began with a fundamental and insurmountable asymmetry that no amount of Soviet firepower could compensate for. Because firepower requires a target, and the Finnish soldiers in their white sheets gave the Soviet guns nothing to aim at. The skis completed the picture. Finnish soldiers had grown up on skis, not as a recreational activity or a military training exercise, but as a mode of transport as routine as walking. The way you moved through a Finnish winter landscape if you needed to cover distance without a road. Finnish boys learned to ski before they learned to read. Finnish farmers used skis to check their fields, to visit neighbors, to carry loads through snow that would have stopped any wheeled or tracked vehicle. The Finnish army, understanding this, had structured its entire winter tactical doctrine around it. Ski units that could move cross-country at speeds that had no equivalent in any army built around roads and vehicles. A Finnish ski patrol could cover 40 kilometers of forest terrain in a single night, not on a prepared surface, through old-growth timber, across frozen lakes, up ridgelines and down the reverse slopes, through snowdrifts that would have stopped an infantry column in its tracks. It could move at this speed silently, without the engine noise or the radio signals or the column formation that announced Soviet movement across every sensor available to Finnish observation. They could appear at a point in the Soviet rear that the tactical map said was inaccessible from the Finnish line, strike a headquarters or a supply depot or an artillery position, and be back across the tree line and moving through the forest at 4 kilometers per hour before the surviving Soviets had established which direction the attack had come from. The Soviet infantry, on foot, in dark coats, on roads that the Finnish ski patrols could bypass without slowing, could not pursue, could not follow into terrain that required skis to traverse, could not predict where the patrols would appear next because the patrols were not constrained by the road network that defined all Soviet movement. The Soviets were road-bound in a country where the forests between the roads were the dominant terrain feature, and the Finns moved through the forests the way the Soviets moved through roads, routinely, confidently, at operational speed. It was not a fair fight. It was specifically designed not to be. In the second week of December 1939, a Finnish patrol operating in the Taipale sector conducted a night raid on a Soviet regimental headquarters that the Soviet command had positioned, with reasonable military logic, in a farmhouse approximately 8 kilometers behind the front line. 8 kilometers behind the front line, in any conventional military calculus, is safe. It is beyond the range of direct infiltration. It requires crossing the forward defensive positions, the combat outposts, the picket lines, all the layered security that a regimental headquarters generates as a matter of standard procedure. The Finnish patrol crossed all of it on skis, in white, in darkness, in silence. They destroyed the headquarters in 11 minutes. They killed the regimental commander and 2 of his staff officers, destroyed the radio equipment and the operational maps, and withdrew into the forest before the nearest Soviet security element had assembled into a coherent reaction force. The patrol had traveled 14 kilometers through forest to reach the target and traveled 14 kilometers back. Total time from departure to return, 4 hours and 20 minutes. The Soviet security element that was sent to pursue them found ski tracks in the snow that led into the forest, and then split in 3 directions and then split again, because the patrol had divided and moved to a prearranged rally point by separate routes in the standard Finnish practice for breaking contact. The tracks went into the trees. The trees went on for a very long way in every direction. The security element stopped at the tree line. This happened not once. It happened across the entire front, every night, in variations dictated by the specific terrain and the specific targets available, but always with the same essential structure. White soldiers on skis appearing from terrain the Soviet maps had marked as unnavigable, hitting a point of high value, and vanishing before the response could be organized. A Soviet divisional commander, his name recorded in Finnish captured documents as Colonel Nikolai Belyaev, 168th Rifle Division, filed a report to the Leningrad Military District headquarters in mid-December 1939 that contained a passage which Finnish military intelligence translated and circulated among senior officers as an example of the psychological impact the ski raids were producing. The passage read, "The enemy moves without roads. This should not be possible in the terrain described in the operational maps. The maps show the forest as impassable without motorized support. The enemy is not using motorized support and appears to regard the forest as a highway. Our men will not enter the forest at night. They say the forest is full of Finns. They are not wrong, but this is not a tactical assessment I can work with." He was right. It was not a tactical assessment anyone could work with. The situation it described did not have a solution within the doctrine available to a Soviet rifle division in December 1939. The doctrine assumed roads. The doctrine assumed a front line with two sides. The doctrine assumed that the space between the armies was empty or approximately empty, a zone of contact rather than a zone of enemy operation. Finnish ski tactics had inverted this assumption completely. The space between the armies was Finnish territory, Finnish movement space, Finnish ground, even when it was physically behind Soviet positions. The Soviet commanders who grasped this, and some of them did, with the terrible clarity that comes from watching your headquarters get hit 8 kilometers behind the front line, faced a second problem immediately after the first one. They could not solve it with the tools they had been given. They had no ski units of comparable mobility. They could not train them quickly enough to matter in an active campaign. They could not issue white camouflage retroactively to 50,000 men who were already visible in the forest. They could not unship the parade band instruments and replace them with the equipment that the actual winter required. They were inside a situation that had been created before the first soldier crossed the border, by decisions made in Leningrad and Moscow by men who had looked at reconnaissance photographs of Finnish reservists on wooden skis and smiled. There was one Soviet attempt to adapt that deserves attention, not because it succeeded, but because of how it failed. In late December 1939, the 9th Army Command, responding to pressure from Moscow to address the catastrophic performance of its divisions in the Finnish forests, issued an order directing the formation of improvised ski units from available personnel. Soldiers who reported skiing experience were to be identified, equipped with skis requisitioned from local sources, issued whatever white material could be found for camouflage, and organized into patrols for counter-infiltration operations. The order was sound in its intent. Its execution revealed the distance between a military skill that is trained and a military skill that is lived. Finnish ski soldiers had been on skis since childhood. They moved on skis the way they moved on foot, without conscious attention to balance, to surface variation, to the management of speed on downhill terrain. Skiing was not a skill they applied. It was a mode of locomotion that their bodies had internalized so completely that it required no more deliberate concentration than walking. The Soviet soldiers assembled into the improvised ski units had varying levels of experience. Some had skied recreationally. Some had skied in training. Some had not skied at all and had reported experience because the alternative was to remain in their units on the road, which they had correctly assessed as more dangerous than any alternative offered. They were issued skis of varying quality, many of them without proper bindings for the boots they were wearing, some of them with poles designed for a different style of skiing than the terrain required. They went into the forest at night, in the dark, in -35 degrees, on skis they could not reliably control, wearing camouflage improvised from whatever white cloth had been found, attempting to move through terrain that Finnish patrols covered in 4 hours, and that the Soviet units took 8 hours to cover half of, and that noisily, with the sounds of men falling, of skis catching on undergrowth, of muffled curses in Russian that carried through the frozen air with the clarity that extreme cold gives to sound. A Finnish patrol that encountered one of these improvised Soviet ski units in early January 1940 reported afterward that they had heard the unit approaching for approximately 12 minutes before it came into range. The engagement lasted less than 2 minutes. The Finns were on their way back to the tree line before the Soviet unit had re-established its formation. The adaptation had produced a new version of the same problem. Soviet soldiers who were visible, audible, and slow in terrain that rewarded invisibility, silence, and speed. Giving a road-bound army skis did not make it a ski army. It made it a road-bound army that was also cold and confused in the forest. Meanwhile, the parade band instruments were somewhere in the supply chain behind the 7th Army, waiting for the march into Helsinki. By the end of December 1939, the strategic situation had produced a document trail on the Soviet side that is, in retrospect, one of the most concentrated records of institutional cognitive dissonance available from the entire 20th century. The operational reports coming in from the field described a campaign that was failing systematically, at every level for reasons that were documented with the reluctant precision of officers who understood that their reports would be read in Moscow. and that Moscow's tolerance for bad news was limited and unpredictable. These reports described men dying of cold in uniforms rated for a different climate. They described headquarters being hit by patrols that appeared from impassable terrain. They described soldiers who could not be made to enter the forest at night. They described ski patrols that struck and vanished and could not be pursued, tracked, or predicted. And simultaneously, somewhere in the logistics system, the brass instruments were still on their trucks, waiting. A disconnect between these two realities, the actual war and the war that the Soviet planning apparatus had prepared for, was not a failure of intelligence in the narrow sense. The Soviets knew Finland was cold. They knew Finland had forests. They knew Finland had forests. The reconnaissance photographs had shown them the Finnish soldiers on their wooden skis, and a senior officer had looked at those photographs and commented on how stupid the skis were. The failure was not informational. It was interpretive. The information existed. The capacity to extract the correct meaning from it, to understand that wooden skis in a Finnish forest in December are not a deficiency, but an overwhelming tactical advantage over any force that doesn't have them, was absent, or present and overruled by the momentum of a plan that had already shipped the banned instruments and could not, institutionally, accommodate the possibility that the parade was not going to happen on schedule. There is a particular kind of blindness that afflicts powerful institutions, and it is not the blindness of stupidity. It is the blindness of scale. When you are large enough, when your power is real enough, and documented enough and has produced enough victories in enough previous contexts, the cognitive work required to take a small enemy seriously becomes almost impossible to perform honestly. The small enemy looks, from the position of overwhelming power, like a problem that will solve itself once sufficient force is applied. The wooden skis look stupid. The bedline and camouflage looks improvised and desperate. The fazendero with his hunting rifle looks like a man who will sensibly surrender when he sees what is coming. And so the large institution does not truly look. It confirms. It sees the reconnaissance photographs and confirms that the Finnish forces are limited. It sees the skis and confirms that this is a primitive army. It ships the banned instruments and confirms, in the most logistically concrete way possible, that the outcome is already known. The forest does not care what is confirmed. The forest has a temperature and a geometry, and a silence that operate independently of what any general has decided in Leningrad. The snow is white regardless of what the operational maps say about the terrain being impassable. The Finnish soldier in his bed linen white is invisible regardless of the Soviet assessment of Finnish military capability, and the man on wooden skis moves through the forest at 4 kilometers per hour in the dark, silently, regardless of whether anyone in Moscow has decided to take wooden skis seriously. The war that existed in the Finnish forest in the winter of 1939 was not the war that the Soviet Union had planned for, shipped supplies for, or dressed its soldiers for. It was a war fought in white, in silence, on wood, by men who had spent their entire lives learning how to move through exactly this cold in exactly this dark, through exactly these trees. They had not trained for it. They had lived it. And when the army that had trained for a different war arrived in their forest wearing dark coats and carrying brass instruments, the forest, and the men who were part of it, received them in the way that any environment receives something that does not understand it. Without mercy and without noise. The instruments were eventually shipped back. There is no record of a Helsinki parade. There is a record of approximately 125,000 Soviet dead across the Winter War. A number that the Soviet Union did not officially acknowledge for decades, and that represented, by any accounting, one of the most expensive military miscalculations of the 20th century, conducted against a country with a population roughly equivalent to a single mid-sized Soviet city. The Moscow Peace Treaty of March 12, 1940, gave the Soviet Union the territorial concessions it had originally demanded. Finland ceded the Karelian Isthmus and several other areas. In the narrow accounting of maps and borders, the Soviet Union got what it had come for. In the accounting that matters for understanding what armies are and what they can and cannot do, the Winter War produced a lesson that the Soviet military spent the following decade attempting to absorb, with mixed results. as the early German invasion of 1941 would demonstrate. But the lesson was there, in the snow, documented with the specificity of body counts and abandoned equipment, and the tracks of ski patrols that the Soviet security elements stopped following at the tree line. The lesson was in the bed linen camouflage, sewn by hand from civilian materials, because the military supply system had not provided what the environment required, and worn by men who had not waited for the supply system to catch up to reality. The lesson was in the wooden skis, dismissed as stupid in a reconnaissance briefing, and then used to navigate terrain that stopped every wheeled and tracked vehicle the largest army in the world could send against them. The lesson is not really about armies. It never is, by the end. It is about the gap between the situation you have decided exists and the situation that actually exists. It is about what happens when you invest so completely in your own assessment of a challenge that you lose the capacity to look at the challenge directly, to see the wooden skis and ask not whether they are sophisticated enough to meet your standard, but whether they are effective enough to meet the terrain's demands. Not whether the bed linen camouflage looks professional, but whether it makes the soldier invisible. Not whether the parade band fits the image of a triumphant army, but whether the war is actually over. Power makes this harder, not easier. The more resources you have, the more you can afford to be wrong for longer. The more victories your system has produced, the less imaginable it becomes that the system could be mismatched to the new environment. The more confident your intelligence assessment, the less carefully you look at the reconnaissance photographs of small men on wooden skis, moving quietly through the white trees. And then the forest receives you, and the small men in their bed linen white slide out of the trees in the dark, hit what they came to hit, and slide back in, and the only sound is the creak of the cold timber, and the distant movement of something that was there and is now gone. The army that dressed for the victory parade died in the snow, because it forgot to dress for the war.